50 million pounds, sitting on a table in front of a man who started this business in a shed because his farm couldn't sell its own barley. Clarkson said no. His accountant, by his own admission later, thought he'd lost his mind. 18 months on, the company he refused to sell is worth 75 million pounds. Because it wasn't a celebrity beer brand, it was a farm refusing to be owned by anyone else's supply chain, and Carlsberg found out too late what that refusal was actually worth. By the end of this, the only question you'll be left with is whether you'd have had the nerve to say no too. Start where nobody else starts this story. Hawkstone wasn't born from ambition. It was born from a problem nobody outside farming ever thinks about. Diddly squat grows barley. Barley has to go somewhere, and the market that normally buys it pays whatever price it feels like that week, regardless of how good the harvest was or how hard anyone worked for it. Clarkson watched a good crop get swallowed by a bad price once too often, and decided the only way to stop that happening again was to stop selling the grain at all. Brew it himself. Sell the finished product instead of the raw ingredient. Keep every stage of the margin under his own roof. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Brewing is not farming. It is chemistry, patience, and the willingness to throw away batches that taste of nothing but your own inexperience. Early on, that's exactly what happened, more than once. Nobody puts that part in the highlight reel. A man who had spent a decade learning, sometimes painfully, how not to lose a herd to disease, was now starting from zero again, in a shed, with equipment he barely understood, hoping the next batch would be the one that didn't need pouring away. That's the part worth sitting with for a second. He didn't have to do this. The farm shop was already working. The restaurant was already full most weekends. He chose to risk failing publicly, again, on something he had no experience in, because the alternative was watching his own grain get undervalued forever by people who'd never set foot on his land. There's a quieter detail buried in that decision that most retellings skip entirely. Barley for beer isn't the same as barley for animal feed. It has to hit a specific sugar content, a specific moisture level, a narrow window that either the weather gives you or it doesn't. That meant the farm side and the brewing side couldn't just sit next to each other. They had to be planned together, season by season, which is precisely the kind of unglamorous logistics work that never makes it into a trailer, but is the actual reason this business holds together at all. Here's where it gets interesting. The beer worked. Not instantly, not by accident, but it worked. And once it worked, it grew in a way nobody in the drinks industry expected from a farm brand with no marketing department and no supermarket deal. 7.8 million pounds in its first proper year. Nobody at a major brewery lost sleep over that number. Then came 21.3 million. 134% growth in an industry where most established names would call 5% a good year. 53 people now have a job because a farmer got tired of a bad grain price. 2,000 pubs across the country now pour a beer that started because nobody would pay him fairly for barley. That's when the phone call came. Carlsberg didn't want a partnership. They wanted the threat gone from the shelf and quietly folded into their own portfolio instead. 50 million pounds on the table for a brand that had existed for 3 years. And here's what almost nobody reported properly. Clarkson didn't say no immediately. By his own account afterward, he thought about it. 50 million pounds is not a number you wave away without a second thought, whatever your bank balance already looks like. 53 people's jobs were sitting on the other side of that decision. So was every farmer supplying grain into it. Saying no wasn't bravado. It was standing at a table knowing that if he said yes, the one thing he'd actually built, something that couldn't be undercut, replicated, or bought out from under a supermarket buyer, would belong to somebody else by the end of the week. He said no anyway. The industry assumed that was ego. It wasn't. It was arithmetic, and it was fear, in roughly equal measure. Fear of selling the only thing in 20 years of farming that had actually worked on his own terms. Stop. Because what comes next is the reason Carlsberg is still watching this brand from the outside instead of owning it. And it's the detail every other video on this topic missed entirely. The rejection itself became the story. Every trade publication that covers beer ran the headline. A 3-year-old farm brand turns down a global brewer. That kind of coverage cannot be bought at any price, let alone 50 million pounds of it. Carlsberg tried to remove a threat from the market and instead handed it a press cycle that made the threat bigger. It is not a beer brand. It is a bypass. Think about what a normal drink startup has to do to get anywhere near a shelf. Beg for space. Pay listing fees that can run into 6 figures per product. Discount to get noticed, then discount again just to stay there. Hawkstone skipped almost all of it because it didn't need a supermarket buyer's permission. It already had pubs, a farm shop, and a restaurant that trusted it before a single national retailer got involved. Look at how deliberately that distribution was built, because it wasn't luck. The farm shop sold it first, to people already standing in a queue for something else entirely. The restaurant put it on the table next to food grown a few fields away, so the story sold itself before a word of marketing was spent. Only after both of those were working did it move out into independent pubs, one at a time, each one a landlord who'd already heard of the brand rather than a buyer who needed convincing from scratch. The council never came near this one. Nobody tried to slow it down, which meant there was nothing softening the growth curve either. It just kept climbing, quarter after quarter, while people who understood beer far better than farming assumed it would flatten out the way every celebrity product eventually does. It didn't flatten. It compounded. Most branded products spike once, on curiosity, and fade within 18 months once the novelty wears off. Hawkstone's growth accelerated in its 3rd year, not its first. Curiosity doesn't compound like that. Trust does. 2,000 pubs now stock something that began as a way to stop a bad grain price. 53 people have a job because one man refused to keep selling his own harvest for whatever the market felt like paying that week. There's a risk in this nobody should pretend away. 53 staff and a £75 million valuation means there's far more to lose now than there was in a shed with a failed batch and nobody watching. One bad harvest, one supply shock, and the same arithmetic that built this brand starts working just as hard against it. That fear at the negotiating table hasn't gone anywhere. It's just been outrun, for now, by growth. And that's really the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire story. Every advantage that made Hawkstone impossible to buy out cheaply is the same advantage that makes it impossible to walk away from cleanly if the weather turns against it 1 year. There's no supermarket contract to fall back on, no faceless supplier to blame, no distributor absorbing the shock further down the chain. When the harvest struggles, it struggles for the beer and the barley both at the exact same time. That is not a beer brand. That is a farmer who once couldn't get a fair price for his own grain and built the one thing nobody could ever undervalue again. Look at what happens next to everyone standing near this, not just the man whose name is on the label. The local growers who'd started supplying it would have been the first thing cut, because a multinational doesn't need a story about one specific field in Oxfordshire. It needs volume at the lowest achievable cost. And provenance is the first casualty of that arithmetic every single time. That's what £50 million was actually buying, whether Carlsberg framed it that way or not. Not a beer recipe, not a brand name. The removal of a business model that proved something inconvenient, that a farm could keep every stage of its own value instead of handing it away one link at a time. If this one got you thinking, subscribe and tap the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of the story. Drop a comment below. We genuinely read every one. Would you have taken the 50 million or sat at that table and said no like he did? Thank you, as always, for watching.